The reading today is Why the U.S. Has Spent 200 Years Flip Flopping Between Isolationism and Engagement. This is from History.com News in January of 2019. What does the United States want to be to the world? And what would the world look like? A welcoming beacon of democracy, a partner in trade and security, a wary but distant ally, or a fortress that has pulled up its drawbridge? Location is destiny. Geography has played a large part in fostering American isolationism. From the perspective of America's heartland, the rest of the world can seem very far away. Ever since the 19th century, when the United States pushed its borders out to the Pacific and down into Mexico, the country has been buffered from the outside world by its sheer landmass. Canada, originally a small set of weak colonies, and Mexico, torn with internal dissent, have never been threats. Geography smiled further on the United States. Its rich resources and ever increasing internal market have historically limited its economic dependence on the rest of the world. Even after 1945, when the U.S. emerged as the world's most powerful economy, most of its trade and investment was within its own borders. And when you add to that two vast oceans on either side, America, unlike most other countries in the world, has had little to fear from foreign invaders for much of its history. That has not prevented sudden panics from seizing Americans. It was only in the 1940s that air power and mechanized navies allowed then enemies, Japan and Germany, to bring war to America's shores. In the Cold War after 1945, the prospect of nuclear weapons delivered by long range bombers or rockets finally brought an acute sense of vulnerability to Americans. History, too, played its part in shaping United States attitudes. On the isolationist side of the scales, the very fact of rebellion by the 13 colonies was a turning away from the old corrupt European powers. We have it in our power, wrote Thomas Paine, to begin the world over again. For many of his contemporaries, that meant staying aloof from other nations in order to preserve American exceptionalism. In his famous farewell address, President George Washington warned against what he called entanglements and against permanent foreign alliances. Europe has set a primary interests, which to us have none or very remote relationship. Our detached and distant situation invited and enables us to pursue a different course. From the American Revolution onward, the intellectual ancestors of today's American firsters tended to view Europe, particularly Britain, as a threat. In the early days of the Republic, the Redcoats fought to quell its rebellious colony. In the Napoleonic Wars, the British invaded American mainland and burned the White House. During the Civil War, and again in the 1890s, there was talk of war between the United States and Britain. Americans also feared dangerous ideas that might subvert its values and, worse, win over citizens' hearts and minds. In the 19th century, when Roman Catholicism was the enemy, a Texas newspaper warned in 1855, "It's a notorious fact that the monarchs of Europe and the Pope of Rome are at this very moment plotting our destruction and threatening the extinction of our political, civil, and religious institutions." A century later, as the Cold War raged, you could substitute communist for Catholics. The fear was much the same and helped fuel isolationism. A 1901 political cartoon that depicts Uncle Sam as a large rooster while European nations are represented by birds in a coop, marked Monroe Doctrine. Outward momentum. Yet the United States has never been able to insulate itself completely against the rest of the world. And there were many Americans who did not want to do that. Among the founding fathers, even George Washington admitted that his country might occasionally need temporary military alliances. Thomas Jefferson was likewise wary of entanglements, but believed in the value of trade to link nations peacefully. Commerce with all nations, alliance with none, should be our motto. Alexander Hamilton went a step further. The United States needed to be as strong economically to ensure its safety and well being, and that might mean making deals with other powers. American leaders were also obliged to pay some attention to their own neighborhood, if only to keep others out. The famous Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823, was initially designed to warn Russia off expanding its colonies in the Pacific Northwest. But over the years, it became a general warning to all outside powers to stop meddling in America's backyard. When President Theodore Roosevelt issued his corollary in 1904, it became the justification for a series of military interventions in and around the Caribbean to protect American interests. In 1914, the opening of the Panama Canal served to intensify American interests in the whole region, just south of its borders. Other forces impelled the U.S. out into the world. The same spirit that took the pioneers westward took Americans around the globe. Sailing ships crisscrossed the Atlantic and ventured to the Far East looking for trade and profits. American missionaries, motivated to a better world, spread out in the 19th century to the Middle East, Africa, China, and India. And when they returned, they preached that the United States had a moral obligation to engage with the rest of the world. In the late 19th century, the United States increasingly projected its growing power beyond its shore. In 1898, annexation of the Hawaiian Islands merely formally recognized what had long been American domination. The Spanish American War the same year confirmed America's dominance of the Caribbean, giving it control over Puerto Rico and, temporarily, Cuba. Even more importantly, possession of the Philippines moved the sphere of interest of the United States far out into the Pacific. Theodore Roosevelt's policy to build a two ocean navy confirmed that the old style isolationism of the founders had not survived the modern, increasingly globalized world. A 1919 editorial cartoon depicting U.S. President Woodrow Wilson as he pulls a reluctant young boy, whose hat reads USA, towards the Temple of Peace or the League of Nations. Drawn into global entanglement. It took a world war between 1914 and 1918 to draw the United States into a deeper and more sustained relationship with the wider world. President Woodrow Wilson, who had hoped to keep out of the war started in Europe, was by 1917 convinced that Germany was a menace to the future of world peace. In line with its long-standing traditions, the United States entered the war as an associate, not an ally, and Wilson insisted that the goal was to build a better world, safe for democracy. Like Jefferson, he saw the United States as a model for humankind. But unlike Jefferson, he believed the U.S. had to engage in the war and in the peace to come to create a new world order. The vehicle he hoped would bring nations together to make common cause for peace and prosperity was the League of Nations. It wasn't to be. Although many American, perhaps a majority, supported the League, Wilson couldn't get the support he needed in the Senate, so the United States itself did not join. The subsequent decades of the 20s and 30s are often seen as a triumph of American isolationism. A powerful lobby headed by distinguished figures such as Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford promoted America first. Congress raised tariffs to keep foreign goods out, limited immigration, and in the 1930s passed a series of neutrality acts to ensure that the U.S. sat out of future wars. Again, however, that was only part of the picture. American diplomats worked closely with the League of Nations. The United States used its considerable influence to settle some of the outstanding issues left over from World War I, and Washington took the lead in negotiating naval limitations in the Pacific. As the world moved towards war again in the late 1930s, the United States, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, gradually tilted its financial and military support toward the democracies. In December of 1941, Japan's attack at Pearl Harbor and Hitler's subsequent declaration of war brought the United States into the greatest and most sustained engagement with the rest of the world in its history. When the great conflict ended, Americans again faced the choice between more or less entanglement or engagement with the world. President Roosevelt and many Americans, both Democrat and Republican, hoped to prevent a new wave of isolationism by ensuring that Americans joined the new United Nations. In any case, the decision in favor of involvement in world affairs was effectively made for them by aggressive moves of the Soviet Union in Europe and the Middle East. The Cold War saw decades of American military, political, and economic involvement around the world in what was truly a global struggle. The oscillation Henry Kissinger talked about was always there. Of course, the Americans had widely different ideas about where, why, and how much should be involved. For many, faraway wars like those in Korea and Vietnam were hard to justify. With the end of the Cold War at the start of the 1990s, the debate took on new meaning. Could the United States now safely withdraw from its alliances, friendships, or partnerships? Or, as Iraq and Afghanistan might suggest, could it best defend itself by fighting battles far from the United States itself? And did Americans still have a moral duty to try and help the rest of the world by spreading democracy? The context changes, but the debate about America's role in the world continues to rage. Margaret Macmillan is a former warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, and a professor of history at the University of Toronto. She is the author of several books on international history, including Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World, Nixon and Mao, The Week That Changed the World, and The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914.